Hi guys, how things? Morning, morning. Ah, sound check. Ah, सब ठीक? So, इंडियन इकोनॉमी सोने की चिड़िया थी, सच या व्हाट्सएप ज्ञान? शुरू करें? जहां डाल डाल पे सोने की चिड़िया करती हैं बसेरा, वो भारत देश है मेरा, वो भारत देश है मेरा. These lines translate as the land where golden birds nest on every branch of every tree. That land is my India. I'm sure many of you would have heard this old Hindi movie song, and those who haven't heard it earlier, well, you heard it now. You're welcome. The main theme of this song was that India was a land of milk and honey in ancient times, among the wealthiest nations on earth. And then foreign invaders destroyed our wealth and made us poor. Many believe this to be true, that India was rich in ancient times and foreign invasions led to our impoverishment. Others say that this is WhatsApp university knowledge, WhatsApp Gyan hai, and that China, Roman Empire and many others were far wealthier and had more scientific plus cultural achievements than us Indians in ancient times. What is the truth? Let's find out. So, was India wealthy in ancient times? Here's an anecdote to help answer that question. The infamous invasion of Delhi by the Persian ruler Nadir Shah in 1739. He looted so much treasure from just one small part of India that he required 700 elephants, 4,000 camels, and 12,000 horses to haul it all away. The loot was so big that Nadir Shah actually stopped taxation in his home country, Iran, for a period of 3 years following his return. According to historian James Fraser, the amount of money looted at that time was 70 crore rupees. Now, in those days, each rupee was essentially a silver coin, each weighing 11.5 grams. Therefore, 70 crore rupees in 1739 is roughly equal to 8 billion US dollars or 66,000 crores today. This is more than the entire GDP of many small countries today. And remember, this was looted from just one small part of India in 1739. India was that rich. But there's only one example, as has been said brilliantly by many. In God we trust, for everything else, show me data. So according to data provided by renowned economist Utsa Patnaik, the British Raj stole US dollars 45 trillion from India during their entire rule. This is $45 trillion in today's money value. Many scholars accept her estimates, but some others don't. They admit that the British Raj looted India, but think the loot may be less than what Utsa Patnaik calculated. So this one study is useful, but is not universally accepted. So let me show you yet another study that is almost universally accepted. This is a study by a British economic historian called Angus Maddison. He studied economic data and GDPs of different lands across the world for the last 2,000 years. By the way, GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and in simple terms is the total value of all the goods and services produced in a land in a particular year. So coming back in any case, Angus Maddison's work, his data is publicly available along with the assumptions and facts that he has based his analysis on. It is almost certainly the most credible analysis available on global economic history. The World Bank called it the only source for the long-run series of national GDPs. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman has suggested the Maddison Project as a data source for historical economic data, as has billionaire philanthropist Bill Gates. So, what does Angus Maddison say? If we look at the data of the global share of GDP from zero common era, that's around 2000 years ago, from zero common era to 1000 common era, the land of India, that is the entire Indian subcontinent, dominated the global GDP. We contributed around 32% of the world's GDP. Now compare it to the biggest economy in the world today, the global superpower USA, which has roughly 15% of global GDP today, according to the Madison Project database. That is a much lower percentage than the 32% which ancient India contributed for over 1,000 years. That surely sounds like Sone ki Chidiya, right? At least it does to me, certainly. But from the 11th century onwards, our decline began. Slowly at first, and then very rapidly. What happened? Our Sone ki Chidiya, the golden bird, was captured and plundered by repeated foreign invasions, one after another. Firstly, the Turkic and Turco-Mongol invasions, and then the European ones. I should clarify that the Turkic and Turco-Mongols are those that we today call Delhi Sultans and Mughals. And the Europeans were the French, Portuguese, Dutch, but primarily the British, Angrez. India, the golden bird that once dominated the global economy and world trade, was brought down to among the poorest countries in the world. When the rule of the last of our foreign plunderers, the British, finally ended in 1947, we would think that our economic struggles were finally over and that India would see a rise once again. But unfortunately, that did not happen. Our proportion of global GDP actually continued declining even after independence, till its lowest point in human history in the 1980s. And then came the 1991 economic liberalization, and we started to see an economic rise again. Finally, after centuries of decline. Interesting story, right? Let's dive into the details. India's historical economic journey over 2,000 years can be divided into 4 phases. The first phase will be the first millennium, from 0 Common Era to 1,000 Common Era. So in this first phase, that's the first millennium of the Common Era, the greatest ruling dynasties were the Guptas, Cholas, Gurjar Pratiharas, Satavahanas, Chalukyas, Palas, Vardhans, among many others. What are the reasons that India did so well in this era with 32% of the world's GDP? Look, India does have geographical blessings, no doubt about it, like a very long and strategically significant coastline and mighty rivers that facilitated massive international and domestic trade at very cheap cost, because the main mode of transportation for trade was through shipping. We also have among the largest areas of arable land in this world. Arable land is basically land that is good enough to grow crops. Like for example, you cannot grow crops in the Sahara Desert, like obviously not, right? But you can grow crops twice or even thrice a year on the Ganga plains. This allowed a massive food surplus which was grown by relatively few farmers. That allowed others in the society to focus on things like trading and manufacturing, which added to India's wealth. We also had critical earth resources like iron ore, etc. This allowed industries to flourish. And we had the monsoon system, which brought water supply annually and also helped our trade ships sail across the Indian Ocean. More about that later. But all of these by themselves do not create wealth. Mother Nature may have blessed India, but all these blessings had to be converted to money through the only way possible: the hard work and innovation of the Indian people. Ancient Indians were world-class farmers, traders, seafarers, manufacturers, innovators, and scientists. Now, you may be thinking, world-class farmers? Okay, I'll accept that. But world-class traders, seafarers, manufacturers, and scientists from India in ancient times? That'll sound hard to believe, right? But it only sounds hard to believe because you weren't taught enough about it in your school book. Many school books say that India was primarily an agricultural economy and opened up to trade and commercial innovations much later under the influence of foreigners. However, archaeological and textual evidence has revealed that India was one of the oldest trading and maritime powerhouses of the world since the days of the Indus Valley, or more correctly, the Indus-Saraswati civilization thousands of years ago. Let me tell you the logical reason for how India became a hub of global trade in ancient times. Economist and historian Sanjeev Sanyal has written about this. But before that, let me make a mention of the Silk Route here, about which you would have learnt in school. Almost certainly, I know I had learnt of it in school. This legendary route had China and Europe as two ends for trade which went along the steppe lands of Central Asia. Along this route, you could carry goods only on camel, horses, and oxen. But there are limits to the amount of goods you can carry on animal backs. So was there a better way? Yes, there was. Just like in modern times, even in ancient times, real trade, mass trade, happened on ships. Because each ship can carry as many goods as an entire caravan of animals. But the problem with ships in ancient times was that there were no engines. So ships sailed either with the trade winds or with slaves rowing in the galleys. I don't know how many of you have seen that old movie, Ben-Hur. Remember, he was a slave in the galley? Yeah, so that was very common actually in ancient times. So ships sailed either with the trade winds or with slaves rowing in the galleys. Now, if you remember school geography, the problem with trade winds, which are permanent winds, was that they flow only in one direction. That was a problem for ships sailing against the winds, right? So because if you're sailing with the winds, no problem. But for the return trip, you're sailing against the winds. Very difficult to sail. This made trading on ships across the world slow, difficult, and expensive, naturally. But there is one ocean. In fact, the only ocean on Earth where the winds change direction like clockwork every year. And that ocean is the Indian Ocean. Why? What's so special about the Indian Ocean? The answer is the monsoon system. As you know, I'm sure you would have learned this in school, but you know it in any case. During the cooler months of the year, winds flow from the northeast to the south over the Indian subcontinent. They're sometimes called the northeast monsoon, remember, in South India. But in the warmest months, the winds reverse direction and flow from the southwest to the north, that is from the Indian Ocean northwards. These winds lead to our monsoon rains, our main monsoon rains, the southwest monsoons in June, July and August, and of course parts of September through most of India. So you could sail out in winter around the Kartik Purnima and come back during the monsoon season, simply riding the wind. This gave a major advantage to Indian traders because the winds themselves would carry their ships. They didn't need slaves in the galley, right? India traded internationally with Elam, that which is part of ancient Iran, and Mesopotamia, situated in present-day Iraq, during the days of the Indus-Saraswati civilization. Seals showing the Indus pattern discovered at different archaeological sites in Elam and Mesopotamia show the presence of ancient Indian goods in foreign land. Silver shekels and ancient Mesopotamian coin with Iranian countermarks have been found in India. Also, documents show that yakka wood from Gandhar and ivory from Hindush was used to construct the Apadana palace of Emperor Darius in Iran. By the way, Gandhar is where Shakuni was from in the great Indian epic Mahabharata. And here's another fun fact, by the way. One of the most lethal weapons in the world during the first millennium, the Damascus sword, was made from wood steel, which was actually manufactured in our very own Tamil Nadu. And for centuries, our Tamil steel was famous across the world. India used to export all of this and many other goods around the world, including to the Roman Empire. We exported a lot, but imported very little from Rome. They paid us in silver and gold coins. That's why there have been huge amounts of ancient Roman gold and silver coins that have been found in excavations in India. The volume of trade was so huge that the ancient Roman naval commander Pliny complained that India was taking at least 55 million silver coins from Rome every year as payment for the goods it exported. In fact, the Roman Emperor Vespasian had even banned trade with India for a short while in the year 17 Common Era because Rome was going bankrupt buying things from India. India also had the greatest universities in the world at that time, such as Takshashila, Vikramshila and Nalanda, among many others. Foreign students came to study here, including from distant China. These universities had the best teachers in the world, but they were also centers of innovation, which helped our manufacturing and craft sectors, which helped our already booming economy. The skills of our artisans, craftsmen, metallurgists, among many others, created the goods that could be exported. And the Shrenis, that is, the guilds of traders, the merchants, besides the seafarers and navigators from all across the Indian subcontinent, played an important role in strengthening international trade and commerce network. These are some of the reasons for India's dominance of global GDP in the first millennium. But sadly, things started going wrong in the second phase. The second phase, which is from the 11th century to the 17th century Common Era. While India's economic glory in the first millennium Common Era brought many trade opportunities, it also became an attractive land for invaders. Lots of treasures to be looted, right? And for various reasons, India's martial abilities to defend itself had weakened. Though that's, another story for why our martial abilities had weakened. Anyway, so in this second phase of our story, the Turks and the Turco-Mongols began to invade and India's economic engine started sputtering a bit. These are the rulers that establishment historians today call the Delhi Sultans and Mughals. As historian and economist Sanjeev Sanyal noted, by 1500, China had recovered under the Ming Empire to become the world's largest economy with a share of 25%. India's share had by now declined to 24.5%. If you remember, at the end of the first millennium, we were 32%, so it was quite a decline. So, why did India's economic engine start to falter during the Turkic invasions and rule from the 11th century to the 17th century? Why did we lose our first position in global economies for the first time? Some answers can be found from travelers' accounts, historical records, etc., like those of Ibn Battuta or the Tarikh-i-Farishta. But before I move ahead, I must explain that the Turks were invaders from the steppe lands in Central Asia. They are called Delhi Sultans and Mughals today by establishment historians. These same historians also call this period the Islamic invasion. It is interesting that India's Marxist establishment historians called Turkic rule as the Islamic invasion, but didn't call British rule as the Christian invasion. Perhaps there was an attempt by the Marxists to equate these foreigner Turks with Indian Muslims, which had very unfortunate political consequences for India. I wish they hadn't done that. I don't know what their agenda was, but it was extremely unfortunate. In any case, our ancestors were very clear about it. They called these foreign invaders as Turushka, which is Sanskrit for Turks, rather than Muslims. Bollywood movies have added to the confusion because they give the impression that these Turks looked like Indians and spoke Urdu. Actually, to us Indians, they would have looked Chinese. But it must be said that they weren't Chinese. They were actually from the steppe lands of Central Asia. They were foreigners. And they did not speak Urdu. Urdu is our language. It's an Indian language. They would have spoken either Turkic or Persian. Most Indians wouldn't have understood anything of what they were saying. And by the way, these same Turkic groups were the ones who attacked and devastated China as well repeatedly. Anyway, coming back to my point about the reason for the economic downturn. During their invasions and rule, the Turks meted out random violence, and there wasn't enough safety, stability, and law and order. If there isn't enough safety, then manufacturing and trading cannot happen that smoothly, right? Obviously, would a trader go out on a trading caravan if he thought he could be randomly killed at any part of the journey? Random violence destroys the basic processes of economies, just like we see today in once thriving nations like Libya and Iraq when they were invaded by the West. This is what happened in North India 1,000 years ago. The South remained stable for longer due to the Vijayanagar Empire, which survived till the 1550s. That was the first reason that our economy started declining under the Turks, random violence. The second reason, the Turks destroyed many of our ancient universities, from Nalanda to Vikramshila and various others. This dealt a body blow to centers of innovation and research. Thirdly, the Turks believed that their interpretation of Islam commanded them to destroy idols and temples everywhere. In their fanaticism, they destroyed many of our temples and temple towns. There was, of course, religious and spiritual trauma in India because of this, but it also hurt our economy. Why? For us Indians, these temple towns were not just spiritual centers, they were also centers for education and commerce. This impacted the natural networks and economic growth that would emerge from pilgrim tourism. Think of the tremendous boost to Ayodhya's economy today with the opening of the rebuilt Ram Janmabhoomi temple. The destruction of these temples also impacted the risk-taking abilities of businessmen in the country. Let's hear Sanjeev Sanyal's explanation on this.
The reason these temples had so much gold was because ancient Hindu temples functioned as banks. And much of the venture capital that financed these great voyages that the ancient Indian merchants were making to all these faraway lands was financed by these temple banks. We have copper plate contracts, and many of them have survived, particularly in southern Indian temples, tripartite contracts between the temple, which were providing the finance, the artisan guilds who were producing the goods, and the merchant guilds who were doing the trading.
And the profits made from this would be used by the temples for the greater good, like temple ponds for water supply, free food and medical facilities for the poor, education facilities, etc. When these temples and centers were destroyed by the Turkic invaders, they not only impacted our economy negatively, but also the charity systems to help the poor. Fourthly, these Turkic invaders also did not invest as much in public infrastructure as the earlier Indian kings did. For example, the Cholas built massive canals in the south. Some of them survive till today, by the way. King Bhoj built dams in central India. Many of them survive till today also, by the way. For example, in Bhopal. The great roads of Uttar Path and Dakshin Path, literally the northern road and southern road, were built in pre-Mauryan times and extensively expanded by the Mauryas, Guptas and other empires. But the Turkic dynasties spent much of the immense money of India on grand palaces and mausoleums for their kings and queens. These palaces and mausoleums are no doubt tourist attractions today. But if your aim is economic growth and helping the poor, investing in public infrastructure like roads, canals and universities is much better than building giant palaces and mausoleums. Now, one exception among the Turkic period rulers was no doubt Sher Shah Suri, who repaired and realigned the Uttar Path, which is known as the Grand Trunk Road today. But it must be noted that Sher Shah Suri was actually not a Turk. He was an Afghan Pashtun, basically a Pathan. So the Turkic kings did not expand the public infrastructure they inherited from the earlier Indian rulers, but in fact ended up destroying much of it either due to their violent conquests or through benign neglect. Also, they spent too much money on vanity projects like palaces and mausoleums, which are frankly of no use to the public, at least not in that coterminous era. Now, all of this cumulatively meant that India's economy slowly became worse and worse. This was particularly true for the northern Indian subcontinent, where Turkic rule was very strong since the 11th century. In the south, the Vijayanagar Empire continued to remain wealthy and economically vibrant. Vijayanagar was the second largest city in the world after China's Beijing at that time, and it was one of the wealthiest cities on earth. But with Vijayanagar's destruction in 1565 Common Era by the Persian and Turkic sultans of the Deccan, India's economic decline continued. Our share of global GDP came down from 32% to 22-23% by the 17th century. And we lost our place as number one in the world economic order after centuries of dominance. For the first time in human history, we became the number two economy. We weren't number one. But worse was yet to come. Enter the Europeans. This was the first episode of the 2000-year economic journey of India. We covered the first two phases. The first millennium, the ancient era, and the second phase was the Turkic colonial rule. The next episode, episode 2, will cover the next two phases, the British colonial rule and the post-independent India. Stay tuned. This podcast is supported by the Dilip Piramal Foundation. The Dilip Piramal Foundation is an initiative by renowned industrialist Dilip Piramal to support dharmic causes across India and the world. In this aim, the foundation has supported art galleries, documentaries, dharamshalas, education, and many other such initiatives.